A little bit of housekeeping. For brevity, I won't be describing every image in my deck because most of them are decorative, but if the image does add value or context, I'll be sure to describe it. I am going to turn captions on because captions, they don't support that here. And for folks that don't know, Google Slides has this option to add captions, and I like to select large text and have it at the top. So toggle them on, and now there's captions at the top. And the reason I like having them at the top is when this gets translated into YouTube, the captions at the bottom won't interfere with the YouTube captions, and the YouTube captions are generally better because people can go back and fix them. But some captions are better than no captions, so that's what we have today. I have mobility issues, so I stick to the podium, so I don't do a lot of back and forth. And then I work for Red Hat. It's a great company to work for, but I had permission issues sharing this. I couldn't open up permissions, but if you go to the bit.ly link scale-accessibility and request permission, I can give you permission, and I apologize. I try to open up permissions before I give presentations, but I'll do that afterward. And the reason why I like to note that is there's a lot of links in here with a lot of great information. So I don't explain or talk about all of it because one slide would take me the whole 45 minutes, but I want to provide like the most valuable information. So again, if you go to bit.ly scale-accessibility and request permission, I'll open that up in the afternoon when I check my email. My name is AmyJune, title, camel case, all one word put together. I am the community manager at opensource.com. I am a hospice nurse by trade, so I understand how some people have complex issues around accessing digital information, and so that's one of the reasons I've become an advocate over the years. There's a QR code if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm on Mastodon in the Drupal community. This is Spotty. I mentioned him because he likes to program and lay on my space bar, so I blame any typo or any sort of extra thing in the presentation on him. He was a rescue cat we got during the shelter in place, and he's a real good guy. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a little bit about what is accessibility because I don't want to assume anyone's skill level, but I'm just going to do sort of a touch level on it. So we'll kind of breeze through some terms and definitions. And then this talk is really about what's new in accessibility because the guidelines are changing. So I talk a little bit about what's on the horizon. I talk about user agents, and if you don't know what that is, we'll talk about that a little bit further because a lot of these new guidelines have to do with how people access our information with assistive technology. So I talk about user agents. I talk about the life cycle of digital assets, a little bit about designing for accessibility, and if I have time, I can introduce some tools and do a quick demo of some of the things I talked about. But that's time permitting because I do like to talk. I'm very tangential, and I have to kind of reel myself in sometimes. But what's nice is this is the last session of the day, so if people want to stick around and ask questions or demo stuff, you know, there's time if you want to miss the keynote. So digging in, what is accessibility? Today, in the context I'm going to talk about, it's about producing rich content that can be accessed across all of your digital assets. And this isn't just websites, this is your graphical user interfaces, this is your applications, this is your GitHub repository. Why do we design for accessibility? Well, we want to be inclusive as we can. We don't want to leave anyone out, and it's kind of the right thing to do, to include everyone in your products. But also, if you need like some sort of stakeholder buy-in, it's the law. It's the law to have your assets be digitally accessible. You know, you want to include that wider consumer base for your product. You don't want to leave anybody behind. And because 15% of the world's population self-identify as being disabled, 15% self-report. Imagine all those that don't report that they are disabled. And we're talking about things like Aging, as we get older, we become more disabled with time. Our hearing, our vision goes down, but we need to think about things like temporary disabilities. Maybe you went and had eye surgery and you have LASIK and things are blurry and you can't see the screen. There's situational disabilities, and this is something like when you have your mouse and you have kids and your kids have stolen the batteries out of your mouse, or maybe you can't find the USB hub for your mouse. But also it could be something like you're at the beach and you're doing work and there's glare on your screen. But then there's also a situational disability, kind of every day, like the mom or the dad on the city bus holding the child and they're on their cell phone and they only have one hand. So that's a situational disability. And a new one that I've come across, like a new term in the last 6 months, is episodic disabilities. These are things that stem from lifelong conditions, like HIV or cancer or maybe diabetes. This is where people live with these episodic disabilities and they experience periods of fluctuating health. So at times they're healthy and fine and temporarily abled, and then other times, their needs they're not very consistent. And then with all of these temporary, situational, permanent, and episodic disabilities, it's important to remember that we can't see every disability we can't see people's life or shared experiences, Not every disability can be seen. There's autism, there's debilitating pain, there's fatigue, there's dizziness, there's learning differences, mental health disorders, as well as the hearing and vision impairments that we typically think of. So again, I do want to go through some terms and definitions just to make sure that, some people have sort of a baseline. This is the slide I was talking about. It has lots of links on it, so please ask for permission so you can visit these links. They're not just from the United States or North America. There's a lot of links here to different disability and web accessibility guidelines across the world. And it comes from the commonlook.com website. But again, if you ask for permission, you can do these links and find out more for yourself. W3C, we might hear a lot about when we're in open source. This is the World Wide Web Consortium, and they've developed a set of guidelines called WCAG, and I've heard it called WCAG, I've heard it called WCAG, but those are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but often you'll see the acronym WCAG. And these were developed with kind of a common shared goal that people could use if they needed guidelines for accessibility. And a lot of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally use these as their base for their standards. Who was it made for? It was made for web content developers. It was made for people who develop our authoring tools. They're developed for people who develop the accessibility evaluation tools, but really they're for people who need that shared standard guideline. And right now we're on WCAG 2.1. We had 2.0. 2.1 is a collection of more than 57 guidelines. I'm not going to go into those because that would be a really long conversation. But it built on 2.0, and this is sort of where I'm going with where these guidelines always change. They kind of build upon what was before them. 2.1 introduced 21 new guidelines, a lot of it having to do with color contrast, around sight and hearing. And they're all based on these principles called POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And this is a good segue to talk about what those mean. POUR is that high-level acronym, and acronyms in themselves are not accessible. So just as a side note, when you produce an acronym, always define it the first time you use it, and then you can use it in the rest of your story. But perceivable has to do with being able to interact with the asset or the website with your senses. You can identify content. You can identify interface elements by way of the senses. Operable means that people can successfully navigate those elements. Those are buttons, controls, anything interactive on the page. Understandable, and this one is really important. People should be able to use your website and not have to relearn your pages from page to page. They should be able to learn and remember how to use the interface once throughout your asset. And robust. We'll talk a lot about this concept today because these new guidelines talk a lot about assistive technology, but robust refers to how people are accessing your information. What tools are they using to interact with your website or your documents or your components? And then WCAG is broken down into 3 levels. There's the single A, the double A, and the triple A. And each A increases the criteria to follow. So A is sort of minimal compliance. If your website does not meet at least this single A criteria, it is really, really hard for people with disabilities to use and interact with. It's really hard for people without disabilities to interact with this at the single A level. Double A is our acceptable criteria. It means that most people who interact with your assets can use it. Most people, it's understandable for the majority of the people. And that AAA is sort of the optimal compliance, which means that your website or your digital asset is accessible to the maximum number of people regardless of their level of disability. So when we talk about AAA compliance, we really are talking about the maximum amount of people for usability as well. The more accessible your website is, the more usable it is for everyone else. So just to break those down, you want to make sure that your website's easy to see, so you accommodate visual needs. There's a lot of people on this planet that live with partial sight. There's people who are completely blind, but then again, those situational disabilities where there's the cracked phone screens, and people can't see the content. The motor needs, make sure your assets are easy to interact with, so accommodate motor needs. This can be people who live with a palsy from paraplegia, or maybe they're paralyzed from an accident. But it's also, again, that woman on the bus with the baby, with single hand trying to access her favorite blog. Make sure it's easy to hear, so accommodate auditory needs. I did that when I turned on captions. Not everyone in here, someone may be hard of hearing, or maybe English isn't their first language. So, make sure that people can understand what's being said out loud. And then make it easy to understand, accommodate those cognitive needs. And this can be people who are distracted, the mom racing around with trying to get her child. It could be just a difficult time focusing. So those are those 4 broad parameters. I want to hold light for the people in the Ukraine who are undergoing some pretty tremendous changes right now, and I also want to hold light to the people in Russia who are forced by their government to maybe participate in actions or dismayed at the course that their government has taken. And I'll take a drink while we think about that a little bit. Up here I have an image of the Ukrainian flag. So, okay, we talked about kind of the guidelines that are there, kind of gave you an idea of how they're broken up into those 4 broad parameters. But how is WCAG changing? What are the guidelines that are coming up for our next projects? So 2.2 is coming up. It's actually slated to come out in April. It's been a long time in the making. A lot of changes have been happening, but, well, they say it will be released in April. We'll see. Much like many of our open source projects, sometimes we see those dates pushed out. But 2.2 has everything that the 2.1 and 2.0 has, but with 9 new items. And I'm going to talk about those new items because they're kind of important. They're different from our traditional WCAG guidelines. Because, well, let's see. even if like you're on 2.1 and that's your compliance level, say you're working on a government site, or you're, on a higher ed and the RFP says, 2.1 guidelines, always strive to be at that next level. That really helps when those guidelines change. If you're on 2.2 now, look ahead and see what's 2.3. The idea is to make your websites as accessible and always kind of move to that next target. There are 2 requirements at that A level, one being consistent help and one being redundant entry. Consistent help, we want to make sure that there is a help mechanism. Remember, we want people to be able to use and interact with our website. Well, it really helps if there's a consistent spot where they can go for help. We've seen chat boxes. They're typically in that lower left-hand corner. That's sort of where it's going. We have our contact us always in the footer. Keep that in mind. People who can't, who don't access information in the traditional way, they're looking for those patterns. So make sure that you have a consistent place for your help. It really allows users to find a place to ask their specific questions and really helps them get their tasks done. Redundant entry. This helps users successfully navigate through multi-process forms, and you can't really see this here. The picture's small, I'm sorry, but it's a multi-page form where some of the same information in page 1 is asked for in page 3. So what we're asking folks is, if you've previously entered information, provide the user some sort of way to have that information populated again. If there's a name on one page, maybe pre-populate it on another page. Have it available for the user to select and copy and paste, because sometimes a cognitive challenge might be reading your email and then translating it into another space. And if you have to do that multiple times, it's exhausting for someone who has like maybe a palsy or something like that. So redundant entry. There are a few in that AA, that minimal compliance level, that have changed. Focus appearance. What I talk about with focus appearance is if you're navigating, like I've lost my mouse or I can't use my mouse, my kids have the batteries. So I use my keyboard to navigate the web page. But I'm hitting tab, I have no idea where I am on the page. So focus appearance means where you are on the page. No matter how you got there, whether it was through the keyboard or whatever, a mechanism that allows the user to see where they are on the page. On the opensource.com, you can see that I've tabbed to the points. And it's in bright purple where I can see that. There's a lot of standards around the CSS around it, but you need to address focus appearance in the new guidelines. So focus not obscured is a new one about overlapping. So I've tabbed through and I'm on that points page, but oh no, my hand went up on my trackpad and that sticky menu covered up where I was on the page. So we don't want that to happen anymore, okay? So when you have a focus state, make sure that people can see that focus state. So sticky menus, the really long stuff, we have to find ways to work around that so people can see where they are on the page. And this includes things like sliders with the granular levels, color pickers, any edible areas where you position the cursor. Dragging movements. I work in Drupal. We have Layout Builder now where we can drag and drop and do like page builder stuff. We want to make sure that when we have things that are draggable, that they're able to be dragged by a single pointer without dragging. So once someone gets on that element, they can use their keyboards, like their plus, the minus, or the arrow keys to be able to drag that. You don't want the only mechanism to be where someone has to use the mouse to do some dragging on your page. Target size. We've always had target size sort of stuff in our guidelines, but the target sizes have changed. They're asking people to have a target size of 24 by 24 CSS pixels in size. So I'm using the geocache.com website there because the sign-up form didn't used to it was this really little button, and now they've made it so the touch target on that is wide enough where I can get to it, you know? Because imagine if you have a cracked screen and you're trying to get to that little target size, so there's parameters around minimal CSS size on that.
And is that the kind of thing that like resolutions are 4K, 8K, now that it's small, and then it gets updated in the future?
Yeah, Karsten asked if it had to do with like resolution sizes and how resolution changed over time, and yes, this will change as resolutions, you know, but it was smaller before, but now that we have the bigger screens, yeah. The last AA component is accessible authentication. We want to ensure that there's an easy, accessible, and secure method for folks to log in to our assets. If you use a CAPTCHA, make sure if you use a CAPTCHA during your authentication process, there must be a method that does not include a cognitive function test. Not everyone's idea of an easy math problem is an easy math problem. Maybe people live with dyscalculia or, you know, dyslexia. And I talk a little bit about this, I think, in the next slide. Yep. So that AAA, that optimal compliance level, there's 2 new ones, I think, yep. Focus not obscured, again, where this is, you cannot have anything obscure your focus. The AA standard was like, let's try not to have anything obscure the focus, but the AAA is we don't want anything obscuring that focus. And then accessible authentication, no exception, is we don't want to block like copy-paste functionality. We don't want to do things, we want to be able to have people store their credentials and use them, you know, so that's the must-haves with the optimal compliance. And they're slightly different, you know, that AA level of like, these are good to haves, but these are you must-haves. We also have 3.0 on the horizon. This specification really presents a new model and new guidelines to make our web content and our applications more accessible because they support a wider range of user agents. They use new approaches to testing for accessibility. They allow frequent maintenance to the guidelines, meaning the guidelines will start changing more. And the 3.0 supports the evolution by focusing more on users' functional needs and improves the accessibility of products on a variety of platforms. And I have a couple of slides talking about assistive technology and what's coming up there. But really what this 2.2 and this 3.0 does is it changes things up a lot, you know, as far as how we think about these guidelines. We're taking into account more disabilities. We're thinking about cognitive disabilities. We never really did that in 2.1 in the original versions of WCAG. We want to be able to apply technologies, more technologies than we have before, opening up spaces for things like virtual reality, augmented reality, voice assistance. You know, a lot of these people were just for like our web pages or our, you know, graphical user interfaces, but these new ones are really addressing the upcoming technology. And my favorite component of 3.0 is 3.2, 3.0.2 or something like that. It says use common clear words. And this is a really important part of accessibility that people don't think about. There's always exceptions for like white papers and technical papers and things like that, but we want to provide clear language for people. We want to make sure that if you have a technical document, that there's how-tos and set techniques for applying and breaking down and kind of crossing over that barrier of entry for people who aren't familiar with your content. So clear language, and I have a couple slides about clear language too to talk a little bit more about it. And also 3.0 introduces new tests and scores and outcomes. It defines conformance levels a little bit differently, which isn't really important, but I like to mention it in case you come across it. So instead of A, AA, and AAA, they've labeled them as bronze, silver, and gold. Same sort of levels, but different names. Made it more sparkly, I don't know. But the important part here is to know that accessibility is not static. It's dynamic, and it's always changing. Not only is your website always changing when you add content, but the guidelines are always changing. Like I said, I don't go into a lot of like the how-tos and the whats, because this is more of that how to fish sort of thing. So really have some resources that you go to every once in a while. The W3C blog is a really good like first source, good place to go. They have a blog. If you do Twitter, they do like weekly posts on Twitter. There's a really nice newsletter called the Ally Project, and that's spelled A11Y. That's a numerum, accessibility, A, accessibility, with 11 letters in between in case you don't know what that is, a numerum. So the A11Y project is on Twitter, but they also have a weekly newsletter. And then LinkedIn. This is an image of LinkedIn. If you go search for accessibility, they have pages and pages of companies that will write blog articles every week, pages and pages of people who you can follow, pages and pages of old presentations. LinkedIn is a plethora for information on accessibility. It's really about kind of who you follow. If you're really into music, your feed's all about music. If you want accessibility in your life, you have to like kind of target that. So user agents, I talked a lot about these. What this is assistive technology. Sometimes we see it abbreviated as AT. And this is any device or software or equipment that helps people. It works around the challenges that folks may have when they are learning and communicating and functioning on the web. So learning, communicating, and functioning on the web for assistive technology. Most folks know screen readers. These are devices that listen to the content of the web page and then convert the text to speech. But also keep in mind that people use these screen readers in conjunction, or people like maybe who have cognitive challenges will use screen readers to help with visuals on the page. So it's not just people who are blind or have low vision that are using screen readers. People use screen readers in different ways. Screen magnification devices. I'm not wearing my glasses, and so on my screen, like everything's plus, 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 plus. As we age, fonts get smaller for some reason, so make sure that your web page is developed in a way where people can magnify the content and not have it become pixelated. Keyboard navigation, I told you a little bit about this, me never knowing where my mouse is, you want, if people are using the keyboard, you want them to have the same experience as someone who's using that mouse or that single pointer interaction. You want them to have the same experience regardless of the device that they're using. So think about things like complex menus. Think about if the interaction is presented in an intuitive and predictable way. So I'm just going to use opensource.com because I can. So opensource.com, when I first started working there, I used my keyboard, and the pop-up would come up to do the newsletter. So there's an X there, right? But I had to tab through every single menu item and every single thing, and all the way down and all the way down, all the way down, and oh no, lazy load. Then I could click that X to get that pop-up to change. We fixed it since then, but that's something to think about, We don't want that. So what would happen if I didn't work for opensource.com? Guess what? I would have already left the page by the time I was halfway down. So it's that user experience. Alternate input devices. To mention a few, there's head pointers, there's motion tracking or eye tracking, single switch entry devices, large print and tactile keyboards, speech and input software. This is a picture of a Braille. I don't know exactly the name of it, but what it does is as the text is being read, it dynamically raises those dots up and down for people to be able to read in Braille. And it uses the speech input. Or not, text to Braille. Virtual reality. Virtual reality is cool, but it comes with new chances to include people with disabilities, and it makes games more accessible, which is really nice. But it also adds to the accessibility problems that can occur in games. You know, as a relatively new technology, new rules and interactive forms still need to be developed. And I'm going to give like one-liner definitions for this list that's on this page. These are more assistive technology and adaptive strategies. We have the eye tracking, which I mentioned before. It monitors the eye movement and to control the pointing, and then people can use blinking to initiate mouse clicks. Folks use accelerators. This is software that helps reduce the effort needed to point and click. All of us, you know, do some sort of keyboard customization. We have sticky keys. We have things that help with one-handed typing. You know, we assign shortcut keys. We change the mapping of our keys depending on our keyboard. Pop-up and animation blockers. You know, some people, the cognitive load of pop-ups are too much, so we have pop-up and animation blockers. And this really just kind of blocks those things from coming up and switching the focus from where you are to the pop-up. We have that refreshable braille display like I had the picture of on the previous screen. We have reading assistants that change the presentation of the content, and they can do things like, you know, customize the font, customize the size and spacing of the font. They can scan the text and highlight complex words and have tooltips and add dictionaries for us. And then there's page maps. Page maps give a little visual of where you are on the page and where the most important information are. So I like to play this game called Roll the Dice with the user agents because not everyone uses user agents in the same way, and not every person just uses one. So I'm on a cell phone. You know, I like cell phones. I need the app to be responsive, whether I'm in horizontal or vertical mode. So I can't have scroll bars on both sides, right? Because how do I get to that when I'm doing this? I can't navigate side to side and vertically at the same time. I'm on the Caltrain, you know, it's really busy, it's packed. I want to watch like my favorite Doctor Who episode. But it's standing room only because it's the Caltrain. And my headphones are in my backpack, but I don't want to be like reaching back in my backpack for my headphones. So I want captions to be able to watch my video and know what's going on. But it's raining, because you've seen it, it's raining in San Francisco today, and I've dropped my cell phone because I've had too much coffee, and now my screen is cracked. I want to be able to turn off my YouTube player and turn off my captions, but my screen is cracked, so I need those touch targets to be big enough for me to be able to turn off those mechanisms. Another common scenario for me is, you know, again, my kids have the mouse, who knows, but I'm using my keyboard, and Grateful Dead tickets just went on sale. You know, I'm not a big Grateful Dead fan, but I like going to the concerts because they're really fun, and it's their last year, that's what they say. But anyway, it's at a super small venue, which is really cool. I've been camping out on the web page for a really long time, hitting that refresh button. But there's a timer. So I finally get on there, and there's this timer, and there's this insanely long mega menu, and I'm on that keyboard, right? And that timer's clicking. It's in the corner, letting me know I'm missing out. And I'm clicking, I have to go through that whole keyboard thing, and I finally get to where I purchase the tickets, and crud, my wallet's upstairs. I have mobility issues. It takes me 5 minutes to get upstairs to go get my wallet. So there's a timer. So we need a mechanism on our sites to extend the timer. You know, there's auctions and things like that, but you know, not everyone can access the information quickly. Something to think about. I'm hard of hearing, you know, so this is really This is a new slide for me. I'm very, very vulnerable here. So the way we deliver content when we're in meetings, we use, at Red Hat, we use content delivery of Google Meet. Fine, we use Google Meet. So here's all our faces on Google Meet. You know, you got all those buttons on the bottom, and you can see everyone, and it's cool, and this is my 13-inch laptop, so I can still see everything, right? But I'm hard of hearing, and I need captions. So when I turn on captions, and this isn't so bad, the captions moves everyone up now. Still doable, right? Like, I can still see everyone. I can still see their faces because I use lip reading to reinforce words sometimes on the page. But it's a meeting, so of course someone wants to share their screen, you know? So what happens to me now is someone shares their screen, the captions are coming up, I have to see their faces. I cannot see what's going on in that slide deck because, one, their slide deck isn't accessible because the font size is too small. They didn't take into account the meeting space they're going into. And one more, someone posted a link and I have to open up the chat box now. And so now it's shoved things even further. So just something to think about, you know, just something as little as like enabling captions makes the other part inaccessible to some people. Have you ever had a product owner describe someone as an edge case? So when you call something an edge case, you're really just defining the limits of what and who you care about. So when you talk about accessibility and talk about maximizing usability, you're talking about having no barriers because no barriers means that there's no edge cases. So again, when you call something an edge case, you're really just defining the limits of what and who you care about. So, you know, I don't mean to be like a downer or anything, but I want to look at the life cycle of a digital project. And this is sort of the traditional life cycle of how we kind of learn, like maybe web pages or when we're building a product. So what's that typical, you know, life cycle? You've got the wireframes and the research, you know, people are talking about it. It goes into UX and design. You know, the UX and design people do some magic and they're making it all pretty. And then it goes into development. But of course, like the content team gets involved because it's really hard to look at some of the stuff if there's no content in there. So there's placeholders added. It goes into stakeholder handoff. Yeah, they're okay with it. There's content creation and editing going on. And then it just sort of pops out and it's done and it's deployed, right? I'm going to go back. Well, no. Okay. So with that really linear process of building websites, there's roles attached to all of those, right? So there's tasks listed in the life cycle of the website with assigned roles for all of those people. And there's tasks assigned to those roles, right? So we have our designers, we have our front-end developers, we have our back-end developers, we have QA people, we have UX people, we have the stakeholders, we have the editors, we have the content creators. We need to make sure that we're giving all of those roles responsibilities around accessibility, not just the QA person testing for accessibility at the end. 2/3 of the issues that QA people face at the end could have been solved in that very first development wireframe and UX discussion. And that's the first phase of that. So a lot of those problems sort of continue down the line, and they're a problem the whole way down. So to fix them, you have to go backwards. So imagine if everyone had this responsibility. Not everyone has to know everything about accessibility, but knowing the component for your role. So if you know about color contrast and how someone uses your website as a designer or a framer, and then the coder knows the part about how to code for accessibility, and then the content creator understands how to create accessible content. Not everyone has to know everything. Everyone has their own special skills and, skill sets. So also, I want to back up a little bit because I get excited. I want to talk about content creators because they're in the website or your digital asset much longer than you are as a developer. You've finished your project and maybe you're doing feature requests or you're doing some bugs, but your content people are producing content every day. So if we train our developers and our coders and our designers and our UX people, we should really be training our content creators for accessibility as well. And I go over some things that make content accessible, towards the end. But they paint pictures with words, and it really does a disservice for them to not understand the idea of accessibility as well. And there's a project that a team is working on called the ARM projects, Accessibility Roles and Responsibility Mapping Projects. And it kind of goes into what roles and what responsibilities can be broken down by roles. So it's called ARRM. So I want to reimagine this linear cycle of a build to our project. We're still going to do it flat for a minute. So if we test for accessibility when we do wireframes and research, we catch a lot of problems that don't get moved forward. And then we test again at the UX and before it goes into development. We test and audit at the development phase while there's placeholder content getting added. And then really the story is if we test at all phases of the website rather than that end product when we get our accessibility audit, it really alleviates a lot of those headaches later on. And I'm going to use a cooking analogy. I like carrot cake. Carrot cake is good. It has carrots and it has raisins in it. But if if my kids make me a carrot cake and they left out the carrots and the raisins, but then they try to shove them in later, it's not quite the same. And it's that same thing with accessibility. You can't really shove it in later. It's got to be baked into the process, because raw carrots and uncooked raisins, they're no good. You got that baked in part. But going from that linear maybe into a secular way of thinking about our assets, we reimagine that cycle in a form of continuous improvement. We need to remember that accessibility is never done. Again, the name of my talk, Accessibility is a Moving Target. We want to make sure that we strategize and develop and that allows for flexible changes over time. And I'm going to say that again because it's really important. We develop in a style that allows flexible changes as guidelines evolve because we know the guidelines will change over time. So I hope that kind of sinks in. We want to make sure that the solutions have impact, that we create and implement best practices as we go. We have retrospectives and we learn. What went right with the first phase? What can we do different? And then we really want to iterate as we go too, right? We want to understand what works and what doesn't. And then it's always going like this. Continuous website improvement can feel very challenging at first. You're wondering why you're in meetings all the time. But once you kind of get the momentum, it's kind of like a 36 horsepower Volkswagen going up a hill. That momentum just sort of keeps it going, and it gets a little bit easier to understand that secular thing. Because a lot of people want their project to be done, right? It's a hard concept to think about, your project's never done. So designing for accessibility. These are just some basics to go over about better usability. We want to make sure that we use visual and semantic space. It's an important visual design tool that helps us identify groups of content and related content and sort of delineate unrelated content. So white space is our friend. We want to make sure that we use clean typography. These are fonts. We want to avoid really changing fonts. We want to limit our use of fonts. That way people don't have to like relearn the fonts from page to page. Stick to a couple predetermined fonts. Make sure that your graphical user interface or your web page has sufficient color contrast. That means that if you have a gray background and a dark gray text, people aren't going to see that, you know. Or maybe you have dark blue with dark red on it. People aren't going to see that. So make sure that your foreground and your background has sufficient color contrast. And this has to do with your buttons on your media players too. So if you're on a video and you have buttons that kind of covering up your video, make sure that as the video changes, those interactive elements are seen and there's color contrast. We want to buy Grateful Dead tickets, so have the ability to extend timing on any forms if you can. Security is sort of a weird one. And you want to support resizing because pictures or our text, if people get bigger, you still want them to be able to see the information. And here's our part about accessible content. This is by no means a complete list, but this is a good first list to kind of learn. You really want to know your audience. You want to know who's using your product. So you fit your language to your audience, and you stick to predetermined reading levels. Readability.gov says to stick with the 9th grade reading level in the United States, but as your content gets global, literacy goes down. So, think about who's your global audience. Make sure you put the information in a logical order with the most important details first, because we don't all read anymore, right? So list those important details first. Alternative text, the purpose of this is to describe images to people who visually can't see them. So I have a picture of a beat-up Volkswagen Bug here, and the alternative text says, a Volkswagen Beetle abandoned in a grassy field. And this is not only for people who are using screen readers, but for me, I live rurally, so I don't have images loading, or maybe I'm on my cell phone and the roaming keeps me from loading. But then also, like, lazy load, people don't want to take the time to lazy load. Maybe the image is broken for some reason, so have that content available for when people can't visually access the information. Familiar words. Use familiar words and combinations of familiar words. Choose language that your readers can relate to or that your users can relate to. So this can change in open source depending on your project, but remember, not everyone who's reading your project page is familiar with your project. So avoid any jargon or buzzwords because it's not clear language to begin with, and they may not be familiar with the jargon or the buzzwords. Be careful using acronyms. Not everyone knows an acronym, BLM could be Bureau of Land Management, or it can be Black Lives Matter, So when you have an acronym or a numerum or abbreviation, make sure that you define it first, so later on down, you can use the acronym. And the words that you use in the copy or your graphical user interface should reflect the words that people use when they enter into their search engines. So it's kind of a little bit of a detail, but if you want people to find your page, make sure that you use those familiar words so people can find your project. And this is plain language. It's a little bit different than familiar language. Language that's difficult to read and understand is a potential barrier for all users, particularly people who have cognitive disabilities or maybe lower literacy rates, or whom the content is completely unrelated. So you don't want to hold people back by having flashy and showy words. And this also, we're in a global the world is our stage now, especially after the shelter in place. When we use plain language, it helps people the language isn't native, for our, English as a second language. So think about that as you write your content. Sentences and paragraphs should be kept short. No more than, 3 to 4 lines per paragraph. You don't want like a whole big block of text. You want to break that up into things like bullet points or easier to digest pieces of information. Walls of text are really hard when you're on a phone or you've left the room and you don't know where you enter. So if you divide your content up in a way that makes sense, like bullet points or headings, it gives people natural entry points when they look away. Okay, I didn't know how long I was going to talk, so I have a thank you slide, but I have more content. But I do want to let people go if they need time to get to the keynote. I don't know what time the keynote starts. I don't want to be selfish. Oh, okay, so I have plenty of time. Thank you. She said it starts at 3. So I want to talk about testing tools. So we have new assets that we make, and we're perfect, and we've made them accessible, right? But what about those old assets we have? What about that technical debt that's been, tailing along with us like that ball and chain for forever? So I want to go through a couple of testing tools that will help with this old content. Admittedly, not all of these are open source, okay? I'm just going to say that out loud and give myself a little bit of permission. I just came across this on Friday. Testing libraries for JavaScript testing libraries. There is a React testing library that I came across, which was part of a wider testing library. And based on the guiding principles, your test should resemble how users interact with your information, right? But this testing library is fantastic because they have this place where you can search accessibility, and it says what libraries test for, like if you're using JavaScript, they're like, oh, in JavaScript we have a library that will test for form fields, okay? You're using Vue.js, it will test for X, Y, and Z. And so this is a fantastic library if you're using JavaScript. It'll tell you, because I believe in test-driven development, so anyway, if you do any sort of like front-end development, please explore these testing libraries from the JavaScript communities. They do a great job with like telling you what type of assistive technology mapping to use. Like I just learned about it, so I don't know all the ins and outs. Visual regression testing. This is a great way to test for, like, maybe you've done an update on your Drupal site, or maybe you've had a lot of content changes. You can set your parameters up for it to test the page, what it looked like yesterday and what it looks like today. Backstop.js is a great visual regression testing tool. It is, I don't want to say easy because everyone's definition of easy is different, but the documentation is spectacular on Backstop.js for visual regression testing. This is an example how visual regression testing works. In a perfect world, you're not working on production, right? You have an environment where you're testing, you have a VM or a multi-dev, So you set up the parameters where you test and it gets pushed. So it goes through a multi-development layer, you perform the updates, then you do the testing process, and then the tool will tell you if it needs review or if it passes. If it passes, it'll take it up to dev, but if it needs review, you do a visual review or you can send it back. So that's sort of like the baseline of how visual regression testing works. And Backstop.js also has the opportunity for you to put in breakpoints so you can test what it would look like on mobile from day to day too. Screen readers, this is an essential piece of software for people who are blind or visually impaired. I invite you to, even if you do something like do voiceover on Mac and just understand how your web, okay, so this is a tricky one. I really do believe that real users should be doing the testing. Like if you're doing screen reader testing, a real user who's blind, who uses that particular assistive technology should really be doing the testing. But that's hard to come by sometimes. So I invite people to sort of just turn on your screen readers and see what it's like. What does the flow of the page look like? Now, they aren't the same as like maybe JAWS, which is a program that's expensive that a lot of people who are visually impaired use. It's not quite the same, but it gives you kind of an idea. And I'll give you an idea if it's accessible on the Mac OS anyway. Keyboard, again, you know, I'm such a big fan of knowing how to use your keyboard. All that functionality that people have, you know, with the mouse needs to go through that keyboard. This includes access to links, to buttons, to forms, to back buttons. Your website and your digital project and your graphical user interface should not require a mouse. And again, that example of the pop-up calendar or the pop-up window, you shouldn't have to go all the way through. And then something to think about too with keyboard accessibility, if you can keyboard into a component, you need to be able to keyboard out of the component. That's called a keyboard trap, when there's like no possible way to get out of that component and then they're stuck. Guess what? People are off your interface now because are they going to take the time to reload the page? We'll see, right? But yeah, if they get into the component, if they get into the calendar, if they get into the form, they need a way to get out. Wave is a testing tool that's browser-based. It's a set of evaluation tools that, it's a visual, you can kind of, it lays out these visuals on the page of what could be more accessible. These automated tools, I don't want people to think that you're going to have a 100% accessible site when you use Lighthouse or if you use Wave, because they're only as good as what they're programmed for. So keep that in mind, like when you use these automated tools. They're only as good as what they're programmed for. I'm not sure what the recent stat is, but last year I think they say like maybe it only catches 35% of the errors. But the way they manipulate the data, a lot of the errors that you have on the website, like 45% of your errors are alternative text. So it looks like people manipulate those numbers because like there's a lot of the errors that get caught, but there's still the errors that don't get caught. I hope that made sense. Axe is a good tool. Lots of people use it. It's in your inspector element. It's a product from DeQ. It's a JavaScript library that is open source and available on GitHub, and they do have paid versions. And next week, DeQ is putting, and I'm not a representative of their company, but they put on like AxeCon next week, so I invite people to like go on and look and see what the presentations are. A lot of good accessibility presentations next week at AxeCon from DeQ. But these are in your inspector window. Lighthouse, it's an open source automated tool for improving the quality of web pages. I see a lot of people say, oh, my Lighthouse score is 100. That doesn't mean anything. It means some, but it doesn't mean a lot. This isn't the baseline you should set your website at. Again, it's programmed. WebAIM Contrast Checker. This is a free website. You see here, you can't see all of it because I put it in a circle, but you can put in the numbers of your colors, like the foreground color and then the background color. And then it gives you a list at the bottom of what font size, or if it's a graphical user interface, if it's accessible or not. So I use this with a combination of an eyedrop tool, where I grab the color off the screen and then I get the color and then I just plug those numbers into the color contrast checker. Because the acceptable rate is different depending on your font size and where it's used. And you know, like if it's bold, it might pass, whereas if you just have it, you know, non-bold, it might not pass. The Ally Project Checklist, this is basically this open source GitHub page that lists all the things that you should check on your website. It's kind of cool. You just, you know, download it or have it next to you, and as you're doing your testing, you just check off the things. Makes it really easy. But But remember that WCAG standard isn't like perfect. So just use these as sort of the reference points, right? And then the Zoom, WCAG standards has declared that your content should be accessible and not pixelated and not obscured at the 200% level. So test your page at the 200% level. So do your command plus plus at 200. Lots of things happen at 200. All of a sudden, your website might go into responsive mode, and there's accordions, and the keyboard doesn't get into the accordions. So your website was accessible in non-responsive mode, well, in full screen mode, right? And then your website can be accessible in responsive mode, but then when you go into plus 200, the dynamics of your page change. And so like it might have been accessible in responsive on your phone, but not responsive at the 200% level. I've seen lots of times where our things collapse in their accordions and you can't get into one accordion or you get stuck into an accordion. So that's a good test to do, is just 200% and go through the page and see what changes. And then of course, run your code through a CSS and HTML validation, because an important characteristic of an accessible page is to be free of syntax issues. And then the last tool I have up here is a readability tool. There's different ones out there. This is my favorite one. In the picture, you can see that they test a couple of different reading scores. So the most common that people will test for is the Flesch-Kincaid reading test, but depending on your country, there's different reading levels. So you pop in your web page and it will give you all the test scores in the different reading scores. So that's a good one. And this is more for like your content, making sure that it's readable. But I always want to emphasize that if it is a white paper, if it's a medical paper, some of these rules don't apply, right? But if it's a project and you want new users and they're not familiar, really think about that readability. And then I have a list of resources, but like I said, ask me to open up that slide deck and you can do these. And it's just links to how to use these and where they are, and then some different conformance levels and good best practices of reading why do we have accessibility, so there's the web accessibility directive. Some of these links just kind of give you a little bit more context about why it's important, who it affects the most. And again, this presentation wasn't mostly about what's the new stuff, but how do you prepare yourself for the next change? How do you keep up to date with all of those changes? How do you convince your team? Well, it's a lot easier when you have the whole team, and that's a pretty big concept too, is making sure that there's that cross-team functionality for accessibility. You don't have to know it all, and that's pretty good knowledge to know. Well, if you're a team of one, then you would have to know it all. But if you have a team where everyone has a role, you don't have to know everything. And it's pretty exciting when you can have a conversation with people and everyone knows a little bit about what you're talking about. So that's it. Thank you. And I'll go back to the... Sorry, don't look if you get visually induced motion sickness. And I should have had the link at the beginning or at the end, but here's the link to the slide deck. It's the bit.ly/scale-accessibility, and I'll open up those permissions. Yes, Karsten? Yeah, I can do Q&A. Mm-hmm.
Happening over there. And on the inclusive language side, sometimes we've been trying not, plain language could be it's like an easy out for somebody. Instead of trying to understand why languages are inclusive, they say, oh, it's not plain, they go on. And there's a back and forth. But this is curious if you come across the differences and similarities of those areas of inclusive and language.
So to me, inclusive language takes on a whole nother dynamic. So I'm not sure I can answer that question in the way you want answered. Because inclusive language to me is accessible language, but it also is language that doesn't leave any of our readers behind or offend anyone. So when we're talking about inclusive language, it could be, not using pronouns or not using pop culture references, because like not everyone understands what a playbook is because it's a sports term for North America, or hit it out of the park, so that's not inclusive language because not everyone understands that from the global perspective.
But when you make it so, when you change from that inclusive thing, the ultimate thing you talk about ultimately ends up often being plain.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And again, there's always exceptions, are you going to write a poem in plain language? Probably not, so. Go ahead.
Do you think it's fair that the guidelines don't force backward compatibility to an older browser such as like Link, LYNX, which a lot of us are drawing?
I do think that that's unfair, and that's something that they've been talking about, because the thing with,
We don't have JavaScript and we never will.
right, and
And you mentioned about the alt tags. I mean, I see a lot of that when you get to links to social media, which I never use social media because I can't in the command line, I don't think, not much of it. And a lot of them, it just says link, or whatever, or hidden link, or, whatever. And then also did I understand that you're a fan of multiple toolbars?
no,
Oh, okay, because
I'm not a fan of them.
I see sometimes where there's I visit some of the TV sites like, I want to say TV Passport or one of them, and the first, I don't know, 50, 60, 100, links, and then you go to the bottom of the page and it's almost exactly a duplicate of what was at the top.
Right. I'm a big fan of skip to main content. And actually on opensource.com, we were having this issue where we have a skip to main content, but we had these like listicles in the middle. So the content was broken up by these listicles. And so now we have a skip to back to content link in the middle, so people don't have to like go through our resource list that somehow is in the middle. But no, I'm not a fan of those.
And then, of course, there's you go to download a PDF file, and all you get is a caret and an L.
Yeah.
All that's there.
Yeah, I have talks on all of those things you mentioned. But the links is sort of a big deal, because people, if you don't understand, not people naming you, but people want to know where they're going. And so when you just have a URL, sometimes that's too long. So really there's these guidelines around links. One, we want to know it's a link, so just underline it, you know what I mean? It can't just be something that looks different on the page. You need to have a couple of different identifiers when it's a link. And then for a screen reader, you don't want it to be just the URL. You want to have, where's that page taking you, Yeah.
And then, of course, since about 2008, maybe earlier, most times you don't find direct links to audio or video files.
Right.
And so I have to use like an external links, to run like YouTube, well now it's YTPLP, to grab them. It's intricate. You have to work with it a lot.
Yeah, but I do want to talk to your point about the backwards compatibility with browsers, because that's a socioeconomic issue too. And like, I'm going to use a project that I work on, Drupal. We no longer support Internet Explorer. And I'm like, there's a lot of people who that's the only thing they have because they live in, they don't have the whatever it takes to have a different browser. And so all of those people, and they actually, when we had this discussion in Drupal, they're like, but that's kind of an edge case. Not that many people use Internet Explorer anymore. And I was like, But yeah, it's hard for that, because I understand, because my brother uses a screen reader and he's back on like version whatever, because for him, he can't afford to upgrade the screen reader, or the screen reader isn't updated for the newer browsers. So,
Like NVDA doesn't have a Linux version.
right.
Windows, and I've asked them about that multiple times, but yeah, I mean, if I could use links, LYNX is the only
Well, in one of my other talks, I talk about how when we do things, everyone should have the content available when they turn off CSS, when they turn off JavaScript, all of that stuff, because not all of us have that enabled by default. So, yeah.
And then, of course, you know, the user agent, a lot of times in links, I'll get a 403 error, so I have to go to the options menu and change that, and then come back, you know, it's like, come on. Anyway, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Go ahead.
I have a comment on the dark versus light theme. So like right now, like dark theme is really taking the lead, like it's really taking the place, especially for developer tools.
Mm-hmm.
But as I know, me included, a lot of developers are actually have astigmatism.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's really difficult to see the white text on the dark background. Some website exclusively only have dark mode, which is really a nightmare.
So I can't speak too much to that because I'm not a developer, but I understand the problem. And I help organize a monthly meetup called Ally Talks, A11Y Talks. And a few months ago, we had a developer come on and talk about accessibility in dark mode. So if you go to YouTube under A11Y TALKS, we have a whole library of videos on all different types of topics relating on accessibility and inclusion. And I think the speaker's name was Sibu, S-I-B-U, Sibu. And it was a few months back, but he talks about how to design for dark mode. A11Y TALKS. And it'll take you to our web page, but we also have a YouTube library. Yeah. Go ahead, Remy.
Thank you for your talk, AmyJune. A lot of great resources. I'm new to the public sector, and I just want to throw out a couple of extra ones. I heard you plug readability.gov,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. There's also plainlanguage.gov,
Plainlanguage.gov.
good one for doing plain language development. And then rolling a lot of all that stuff into one system is the U.S. Web Design System. It's designsystem.digital.gov.
Designsystem.digital.gov. Okay. I like to repeat it into.
Absolutely. And it's, you know, a CSS and design framework and language. It has it implements a lot of the things that you're talking about, and there are a lot of contributors. It's an open source project as well. So if there aren't a lot of the tools or methodologies or patterns you're talking about, it's a great place to contribute because
Good.
there's a lot of folks that have to use those websites.
Right. No, thank you, Remy. Okay. Last session of the day.